It begins, as so many things do in these cursed times, with a tweet. Brunch party, concert, party at this bar, concert, party at this club, concert. For real, where do the quiet gays go? The original user has since privated their account, but not before this tweet ended up on my timeline and gained a slew of responses. Chances are, if you're watching this video, you too are a bitch who dreams of winning the lottery so you can create a queer bakery / library / board game cafe / community hub and live your cozy dreams. Maybe you're one of the people replying to this tweet, agreeing with their frustration at the prevailing image of Pride being a non-stop party that exhausts you to just think about. Or maybe you've heard that tweet just now and rolled your eyes. They should just start their own quiet gay activities if they want them so bad, right? On the surface, this topic seems like a simple case of party gays over here, quiet gays over there. Some people like to drink and dance and stay up late, and some people like to play board games and read quietly in a local library. Except, would it be a Rowan Ellis video if I wasn't taking some throwaway tweet or perpetual piece of community discourse and making an hour-long video digging into a bunch of related topics from sociology to queer theory to history in my own brain? Of course it wouldn't, because my hobby, and I guess now my job, is having ADHD and overthinking myself into a research hole. Like the great Renaissance painters of old or the masterful wordsmiths of RuPaul's Snatch Games, I truly find inspiration everywhere. So first, I guess we have to ask, does this tweet have a point? I mean, if we look at some stats, say this report from 2019, I guess it does. According to Travel Gay, in the 6 British cities with the most LGBT venues, London, Manchester, Brighton, Birmingham, Liverpool and Newcastle, there are a total of 95 bars and 51 clubs, but only 4 cafes and 2 restaurants. So in England, there's clearly a disparity between the number of queer venues for party gays, nightlife, over 18 activities, things like that. It might be possible to argue that this is just the percentage split of queer interests if it wasn't leaving even some major English cities with seemingly no provisions for the quiet gays amongst us. The tweet sentiment is also echoed in other online posts. Everywhere I seem to look, queer culture seems to be heavily equated with partying. My partner's gay best friend goes downtown and parties till the break of dawn for Pride. To celebrate seems to mean to be loud and out and proud, to be bright and neon, to be camp and flamboyant, to let loose. Late nights, clubs, DJs, raves, it's all just too much for me. In fact, I sort of feel a disconnect with Western queer culture as a whole. It just feels so extroverted. The thread discussion that this user created had a number of supportive comments and suggestions, but also another user claiming that the loudness of Pride was the point, equating what was seen by the poster as extroverted activities as synonymous with Pride itself, confidence in your own queerness, and a key aspect of feeling part of the community. I think this is a conclusion you could come to pretty easily. The idea that being queer, especially in a way that is transgressive or radical, is something that involves the kind of being out and proud that this user doesn't feel suits them. When people talk about Pride in the endless back and forth debates online, the idea of what Pride is or what it is for often seems to exist on 2 sides of the extrovert gay scale to me. You're either shouting at a party or shouting at a protest. I think it's useful to break down the implications of the loud gays activities, because they are essentially a shorthand for the traditional idea of the gay scene in many cities. They each hit on ideas of nightlife, of spaces with alcohol and substance use, and of a party atmosphere. Those that don't feel they belong in these spaces may well be uninterested or uncomfortable or even unable to engage with one or all of these aspects. And so this is more than just an introvert versus extrovert complaint on the site formerly known as twitter.com to me. It might just have been a tweet that I saw the other day, but it's got me asking some questions. So won't you join me for the quiet gay activity of probably listening to this video essay as you clean your kitchen or do your laundry in the comfort of your own gay house? Historical queer spaces. Many of the queer spaces that we know most about through history are intrinsically linked to this idea of nightlife in particular, a type of socializing that happens after dark, with the pull for patrons sliding between wholesome elements of community and shameless seeking of sexual connection. The reason we know so much about these types of establishments, of course, is a depressing one. It's because these are the ones preserved in court records and scandalous newspaper reports. Take the infamous Vere Street Club, for example, a queer meeting place within the Swan Public House in London, which was raided in 1810. There are dozens of sources, from reports about the initial raid, the transportation of over 20 patrons arrested there, the trials, and the subsequent execution of 2 of the men, one only 17 at the time of his death. The disgust with which this place was regarded is clear in the words of journalists at the time. The rendezvous of a society of miscreants of a detestable description, as well as reports of the reaction from the public towards those who were released. The multitude, male and female, fell upon them as they came out. They were knocked down, kicked, and covered with mud through every street in their endeavours to escape. There are no sympathetic descriptors, no attempts to understand these people, no examination of what might have driven them to hide away in secret. There's just the euphemistic certainty that they got what they deserved. These unnatural relations, of course, being a capital offence at the time, and for decades afterwards in England. The Vere Street Club was what was referred to as a molly house, described by writer James Delisle as found often in rookeries, equivalent to modern-day slums or ghettos. Molly houses would provide a place for men to meet for sexual liaisons that was somewhat safer from law enforcement actions than cruising in parks, such as St James's Park, which is popular at the time. The equating of these venues primarily with cruising spots, however, doesn't tell the full story. They were also spaces of community celebration, hosting festival nights, allowing patrons to wear clothing of any gender, and often delineating spaces for sex away from the main meeting space. We can see in the trial records of another molly house, Mother Clapp's, in the 1700s, that it had a marrying room that men might retire to together. Although the marrying here was initially euphemistic in nature, there were also celebrations of a more formal kind to proclaim the love between partners in long-term relationships. In his research into Old Bailey documents, historian Richter Norton found one molly wedding was celebrated between a butcher named Thomas Coleman and John Hyans, a French immigrant known as Queen Irons. They had previously been pilloried together and imprisoned for 3 months. These spaces were born of necessity. They were hidden in shadows and slums because of the dangers of being in the open. They created environments where sex and relationships were centred because domestic partnerships or even one-time affairs within their own houses were impossible for most. We see similar public sentiments around queer venues across the pond. One description of a queer bar operating in New York in the 1800s, named The Slide, reads, "Much has been written about the degradation, corruption and wickedness in the slums of the city, but there the poor wretches shrink from notoriety, while the abandoned creatures in Stevenson's The Slide make nightly a public exhibition of their evil doings. These beings, without moral sense or shame, are billed as the chief attraction in that pit of shame." Jesus. Sounds like my kind of place. Queer theatre shows and drag balls were seen in the States from the 19th century, creating a source of community for many of those attending and performing. For some, it was an economic proposition, especially during eras like the pansy craze, where gender nonconformity became a sellable performance one might be able to use to disguise genuine trans and non-binary experiences. During this era, these balls were a source of entertainment for visitors outside of the community itself as well. This idea of straight and cis audiences coming to queer venues as a source of novelty is, ironically enough, still a point of contention today, shall we say, but at the time there were reasons to keep these patrons coming. Though New York City may have been the epicenter of the so-called pansy craze, gay, lesbian and transgender performers graced the stages of night spots in cities all over the country. Their audiences included many straight men and women eager to experience the culture themselves and enjoy a good party, as well as ordinary LGBTQ Americans seeking to expand their social networks or find romantic or sexual partners. Although the balls and drag halls had long been spaces that shunned racial segregation, with reporters at the time making a point of commenting on the diverse range of patrons and performers, that didn't mean that they were free from prejudice. Specific venues and events for Black and Latino queer people emerged from these original spaces, and the specific drag house style of community that we still see today emerged in the 1970s, starting with the formation of the House of LaBeija. Over the course of the 20th century, queer bars and clubs also emerged and experienced subsequent backlash. The New York Liquor Authority even prohibited serving alcohol to homosexuals in the mid-60s. The community pushed back with the famous sip-in protests at Julius Bar, and once the law was overturned, we saw the opening of possibly the most famous queer venue in history, the Stonewall Inn. Stonewall was mafia-run, like many other gay bars in New York at the time. With a history of being raided or shut down, queer venues weren't exactly a healthy business prospect for the average landlord. But suppose you had an untapped customer base and also the built-in ability to bribe your way out of trouble. Well, that seemed like an opportunity. The lack of oversight reportedly also, however, created a venue that might be heralded as the location of the origin of modern gay rights, but was also sort of a dump. With little police enforcement of local laws, Fat Tony was able to cut corners on safety and hygiene. bartenders did not have access to running water behind the bar, so often served drinks in dirty used glasses. In violation of city code, Stonewall also lacked a rear exit, leaving the narrow front door as the only escape in the event of a fire or emergency. The alcohol served at the bar, rumoured to be stolen or bootlegged, was watered down and sold to patrons at top-shelf prices. Stonewall's owners also reportedly engaged in extortion. Employees singled out wealthy patrons who were not public about their sexuality and blackmailed them for large sums of money with the threat of being outed. This practice eventually became the most profitable aspect of the mafia's club management. This image of a bar full of danger, from the booze to the ownership, where drinks were expensive and despite the mafia association, the premises were still raided, it shows to me the intense desire for community spaces that existed at the time, that these kind of venues were kept in business by often what seems like pure desperation. However dangerous it seemed to be inside, it was still safer than outside, whether that was to talk, flirt, hook up, or dress however you wanted. And speaking of dressing how you want, now seems like a good time for an ad from this video's sponsor, Matchmasters, who are offering the chance to win a £250 gift card for trans-founded queer apparel company Spectrum Outfitters. The allegations from my podcast co-host Jazza that I have never played a game in my life have been well and truly proven wrong at this point, because Matchmasters is the world's most popular multiplayer match 3 game, and they are sponsoring this video. You play one-on-one matches with these rapid-fire, quick-thinking games to compete for the highest score. For most games, you start with only a couple of moves, but then every time you play combos and use boosters, you can add more moves to your turn to stack up your points. It involves a bunch of strategy thinking that, as a former non-game player, doesn't necessarily come naturally, but it's admittedly very rewarding when I figure out a smart way to play and don't just panic as soon as I see the time running down. I have in fact begun to pick options that are not just based on how cute I find the characters, although I did introduce my friend Sparks to the game, who is notoriously obsessed with owls, and he is currently refusing to play without using the tiny owl mastermind character, which honestly I do respect. You can play live with friends, get matched with another person, playing anywhere in the world, or play in solo mode. And any of these modes will work if you want to enter the giveaway that I mentioned with Spectrum Outfitters. Spectrum have this amazing selection of queer clothing, binders and packers, pins, keychains, swimwear and more. This giveaway is only open to those who download Matchmasters using my link in the description. Once you earn 250 trophies, you can enter into the giveaway for the chance to win a £250 gift card to spend on whatever your heart desires, like this Turf Tears mug or this book by Cody, who guested on my last video essay. So if you want to join me in my new gamer lifestyle, or are a pro already thinking of better moves that you would have played instead of what I did in that clip a few seconds ago, then click on the link in the description to download Matchmasters for a chance to win. Okay, back to the video. Grab the drinks menu. These spaces arguably created a norm within the developing queer social space, that nightlife, drinking, partying and substance use were a quintessential part of the queer experience itself, that to find community you needed to not only visit, but also participate in specific spaces. Moreover, as activist Tom Hill explains, the queer movement that immediately followed the Stonewall riots in 1969 was largely informed by the experience of the New Left counterculture. An important underpinning of this new youth-oriented culture was the widespread use of substances as a means of expanding awareness, deepening enlightenment, and promoting pleasure. These ideas about the use of drugs and alcohol were taken up by some parts of our community, and coupled with queer bar culture, became established norms of queer behaviour and community life. In this context, the sentiments of those in the community asking, "What about the quiet gays?" doesn't feel unfounded. For decades, often due to the constraints of queer and transphobic laws, policies and attitudes, spaces seen as for the party gays were the most viable option for anyone who wanted to find and participate in the community at any level. I think when we look at the difference between the concepts of being a quiet gay and a party gay, the type of person that fits under each may well be a matter of perspective. The examples in the tweets, however, are all of public venues that involve an emphasis on the party aspect, not just brunch, but a brunch party, or else are loud or late at night, like the examples of concerts or gigs. On the other side, people talking about quiet gay activities were much more likely to be at home or in specific kinds of public space, libraries, cafes, community centres. namely spaces that are sober by their nature. The presence of alcohol and drugs wasn't mentioned specifically by many in the initial discussion, but the pattern is obvious when you look, and that to me feels worth exploring, because alcohol and substance use within our community is tied not just to the history that I've talked about so far, but also many current experiences of queerness. If you spend any time looking at the state of LGBTQ+ mental health and working with queer charities, organisations, you'll most likely be familiar with some of the stats around the use and abuse of alcohol and drugs within the community. LGBTQ+ people are more likely to drink or take drugs than their straight and cis counterparts. The Stonewall Health Report in 2017 read, according to the Office of National Statistics, 1 in 10 adults in general, 10%, drink alcohol on 5 or more nights of the week. 1 in 6 LGBT people, 16%, said they drank alcohol almost every day over the last year. If we're looking at Pride in particular, we can see the ties that this celebration have with using to excess. The Brighton Beach Patrol reports that a quarter of its interventions taken last year to prevent intoxicated people from drowning occurred during Pride weekend. While I think that a big day of celebration in the UK's queer capital is as reasonable a time as any to get off your tits, there's potentially something deeper here. For some people, regardless of identity, alcohol is a tool that allows them to relax into social spaces, takes the edge off, it lightens the mood, drops some of their inhibitions to let them get out of their head enough to not worry about what other people think of them. We see this being used specifically by members of the queer community to enhance their experience of their gender or sexuality in a way. An expectation of this potentially decreased agency during intoxication positions alcohol as a discursive excuse for such norm violations, thereby reinforcing the spaces of intoxication as uninhabited, liberating, and potentially transgressive. In these spaces, disinhibited bodies may explore desires and identities normally restricted. As Elle explained, a lot of gay people I know, including myself, sort of began being sexual through drinking because it was sort of more acceptable to explore that when you're drunk. Or because a lot of discomfort around your body or with exploring this new sexuality is easier to cope with if you are drunk. If we focus purely on the numbers, then it's easy to assume that these increased rates are due to some form of coping mechanism or minority stress, diving into a hedonistic escape from a life of oppression. But many study participants and interviewees have talked about queer substance use as an important part of their own development, used strategically to foster community and connection, or a form of queer joy and celebration. In fact, for some, substances could be used strategically to navigate social places, such as deepening relationships to queer social spaces versus tolerating heterosexual social places. Where the spaces where they were more likely to employ maladaptive coping strategies were non-queer spaces. There have been a number of pieces of recent research that dig into the damning statistics around substance use on a more personal level. Behind these numbers are people with their own stories and motivations, and it's clear that non-sober spaces and experiences have been part of many people's journeys exploring their queer identities and communities in a very fulfilling way. Straight and cis people have no specified default social space, functionally claiming all space as their own unless stated otherwise, or unless other marginalized experiences intercede, as the same might be said of the default social space being white or able-bodied, for example. The bar or club as the primary queer social space ultimately necessitates alcohol consumption. It is what the space is for, what allows it to stay in business, what it sets it apart from a cafe or restaurant. It is what is expected of those within it. This connection fed into corporate involvement with Pride and the wider community. Absolute Vodka became the first mainstream brand to take out a full-page ad in a gay magazine in 1981, for example. In the 80s and 90s saw the emergence of alcohol and tobacco adverts targeted specifically at queer consumers in gay publications like The Advocate. Since mainstream media outlets still prohibited LGBTQ+ representation, their legacy and connection to the community is still a big part of their brand messaging today. When we discuss criticisms of the commercialization of Pride, the involvement of alcohol companies feels front and center to me. It might be easy to see them as some kind of pioneering corporate ally, but ultimately they're chasing a profit. And this was a market that they could buy the loyalty of, gaining a foothold across the few in-person locations specifically for us. Drinking has historically been regarded as such a cornerstone of queer culture that these companies are happy to sell to us because the potential to gain us as clients has outweighed the protests from prejudiced factions. But some question the ethics of the extent to which Pride events accept the corporate backing of companies whose products seem to disproportionately harm our community. Because at best, it's, simply about fun, allowing people to let loose and maybe even gives them a mini confidence boost to explore parts of themselves that they feel are harder to engage with in normal life while in a community environment that they feel safe in. But at its worst, we have the fact that the LGBTQ plus community doesn't just have higher rates of use, but also substance misuse and misuse disorders, and also are more likely to begin treatment with more severe presentations. In England and Wales, LGBTQ plus charity London Friend points out, drug use amongst gay and bisexual men is 3 times higher, 33%, than use amongst heterosexual men, 11.1%. For lesbian and bisexual women, use is more than 4 times as high, 22.9%, than that for heterosexual women, 5.1%. Now, addiction is a complicated experience, but knowing factors that impact addiction rates quickly lays out a potential picture for why it is more prevalent in our community. I want to point out here that genetic factors are a huge element when looking at addiction overall, but for the purpose of this video, they're going to be pretty much the same within and outside of our community. But we do know that those with other mental health issues are at higher risk, and that the LGBTQ plus community suffers from higher rates of mental illness. Although it's important to point out, not as some inherent part of being queer, these conditions are often exacerbated or brought on by anxiety and fear, understandable within queer and transphobic environments, or acute experiences of trauma. In one article, science and health journalist Brian Mastroianni reports on the topic of addiction within the queer community, interviewing one man named Mark. The next 20 years or so, all I knew was that if you were gay, you go to bars and clubs. Over the years, you're just trapped. You don't have a choice. It's like, you're gay, here's a bottle, here's a bag. He said now that he's in recovery, he's had the realization that a past social life that revolved solely around drugs and alcohol was one that helped him feel numb. In Mark's experience, going through life as a gay man meant dragging around the emotional baggage buried in his subconscious, anxiety and trauma from bullying and rejection. We are also a population with higher rates of homelessness, and addiction and homeless experiences work for many people in a vicious cycle. Struggles with one can lead to the other and vice versa, but also each makes the other harder to escape, and a particular contemporary concern is a connection between sofa surfing experiences of homelessness and the chemsex scene. Chemsex is, as a broad definition, using drugs as part of your sex life, but in this context specifically refers to the use of mainly meth, crystal and G. These are likely to be used to prolong and enhance sex, with some parties lasting for days and involving multiple partners. In London, it has come to be a large part of certain queer spaces. London Friend published a gay men's sex survey which delved into chemsex, engaging in sex while under the influence of psychoactive drugs, and found that over 14% of men who have sex with men in London engage in the practice. This can lead to devastating consequences, with the Met's LGBT+ advisory group labelling chemsex as the crisis of our time for LGBTQ+ communities. While for many it's engaged with in a safe way with levels of consent and control that everyone involved feels happy with, there are also issues that can arise from compromised awareness and potential dependency when it comes to participants' safety, self-image and mental health. This is especially worrying when chemsex initial experiences have been linked with vulnerable factors, including unemployment, unstable housing and lower social support. The explicit and specific involvement of drug use also runs the risk of anyone looking for support after negative experiences, including assault, feeling unable to report it officially. Ultimately, this all comes down to the underlying frustration present in that initial tweet, the tyranny of expectations, and lack of immediate alternatives. For those excited about the loud gay scene who come to it proactively with a sense of control and autonomy, amazing. The issue is not that these spaces or experiences exist, it's the perception by many, particularly young queer people, that this is a kind of obligatory rite of passage if they want to experience community. In a 2018 paper, LGBT Communities and Substance Use in Queensland, Australia, Perceptions of Young People and Community Stakeholders, they reported on the attitudes of young people shown in a number of interviews. It was also argued that alcohol and other substances are a common occurrence in these environments. It's like your access card to the community. In this context, peer pressure to drink and use substances was considered to be considerably higher in LGBT communities by the majority of sexual minority young people in comparison to the general society. These assumptions about what being queer is and what it involves are tied to a very particular experience. And this isn't necessarily a surprise if we look at a potential roadmap of a young queer person's life. They don't have any LGBTQ plus information given to them in school, and then their family don't know anyone gay, especially no one near their age. There are no queer youth groups in their area, maybe, and they'd feel unsafe asking for the option to be created in their school or church. The internet might provide a general experience of community depending on the spaces they found themselves in, but a surefire space to find queer people in person is an LGBTQ plus venue venue, or a dating app where you can literally filter by sexuality and gender. And it's not just public perception that might lead young people to assume bars and clubs are their only option to feel accepted or find community. This lack of alternative spaces is very real. A UCL Urban Laboratory report commissioned for the Mayor of London found that between 2006 and 2017, the number of LGBTQ+ venues in the capital fell from 125 to 53, a net loss of 58% of queer spaces. These venues include gay bars, 44%, nightclubs, 34%, pubs, 33%, performance venues, 26%, cafes, 4%, and other unspecified queer spaces. While I was growing up, there was one queer cafe that I knew about that felt safe and welcoming in London, called First Out. The cafe was shut down permanently in 2011, however, after 25 years and never reopened because the premises were in the path of the Crossrail expansion, and I was genuinely devastated. First Out was a typical cafe when you walked in. Nice drinks and bakes, indie artist prints on the walls, nice big window, but it also had a downstairs space that opened in the evenings that served alcohol. It felt like a space that bridged the gap between these differing needs of the community. One report on its closure interviewed staff and patrons, and it was clear that a solution to this issue of providing alternatives to the typical party scene has long been desired. This is home for so many people, including staff, says manager Joe Moores. Our customers appreciate that this is not part of the gay meat market. It's much more of a friendly hangout, and everyone is welcome. There's plenty of romance and the odd bit of snogging throughout the basement bar and upstairs cafe, but you're as likely to see lone customers with their laptops relaxing after a workout at the gym and couples dropping in after a day's shopping. For many venues, gaining a license to sell alcohol is what keeps them afloat. Otherwise risky or potentially unprofitable endeavours, including theatre companies like Shunt in the 2000s, could be economically supported by installing a bar. Alcohol is what keeps many queer venues open, especially without investor backing or the possibility of a franchisable venue model. You could argue that this makes non-sober spaces a necessity. Better to have these venues at all than risk them going under because of lack of funds, right? Well, won't somebody think of the kids? One of the key issues of the predominance of nightlife and party spaces being the default queer venue or event is the age limit. The focus on environments that are purely 18 or 21 plus, depending on the country and nature. We know that the average age that people are coming out is getting lower as more information and support is available at an earlier age. Yet are provisions for community expanding to meet this reality? I don't think so, or at least not fast enough. There are such specific vulnerabilities and challenges that can affect queer youth that should make spaces for them, to my mind, a priority. They might have a lack of power in terms of living arrangements or where they spend their time. As adults, we can leave an unsupportive or unsafe job or housing situation a hell of a lot easier than a teenager still at home with parents, guardians, or in the foster system. They don't have the independence to be able to move to be closer to queer communities or more accepting environments in the way we might be able to. They also don't necessarily have family connections to their marginalised queer identities in the way that they might around racial, religious, or class-based experiences. These identities are most often something shared with parents and siblings from birth, but queerness comes later and is often different from anyone else in your family. In many cases, sadly, it isn't just that your family is ignorant around LGBTQ+ culture, history, or experiences, but they might be actively hostile. At a time when they may well need that community most, what is there for queer youth? Back in the early 2010s, I attended a Stonewall Schools conference full of educators and students looking to learn more and share experiences and advice. I vividly remember a speaker from a national youth safety charity talk about how they'd predicted with the rise of the internet and messaging platforms that they'd need to be concentrating on young girls being taken advantage of online. But what they found surprised them with the number of queer boys in particular who were lying about their ages in order to meet up with gay men. The charity were engaging with these boys who felt that they had no other option to access some form of connection to the LGBTQ+ community. They were desperate to speak to another gay person, to experience romance and sex in the way that their straight friends were, but they didn't see how to have those things in a safe and age-appropriate way. To my mind, if we're looking at the potential for queer community spaces, it doesn't feel like enough even to just have weekly youth groups scattered across big cities, where queerness is the only connecting factor between these young people. LGBTQ+ teens have just as much diversity of interests and hobbies as anyone, and deserve to have access to queer youth book clubs, sports teams, craft groups within safe environments. And yes, for those who want it, youth discos or proms or battle of the bands, I don't know what young people are calling their evening party events these days, but You know what I mean. But instead of expanding to meet the need of young people, we've seen a rise in moral panic around queer and trans youth, both around LGBTQ plus adults creating supportive spaces for them under the accusations of grooming, but also the youth themselves, who are seen as brainwashed, mutilated, or mentally ill. Removal of resources for queer and trans kids is seen by many as the same as protecting them. To me, these things are all connected, right? The discussion of events for quiet gays is tied to the provisions we put in place for queer youth, is tied to the sinful perception of adult queer spaces, serving only to limit what is allowed. Accessibility. There are other people left out of the current prevailing view of queer life and spaces, or sometimes physically kept out. There are stereotypes of infantilization and underestimation which can create a picture of disabled people as solely on the side of the quiet gaze by their very disabled existence, uninterested in the kinds of sexual party atmosphere or late night drinking that nightlife conjures. So I think it's vital here to point out that many disabled queers are also party queers. But in a world that is often inaccessible in so many ways, many existing queer venues are unusable by disabled patrons, the same as these other spaces. She Bar, for example, the only lesbian bar in London, has a set of steep steps down to the venue itself. This renders it inaccessible not just to wheelchair users, but people with many other mobility issues too. Those searching for a straight pub or bar have much more choice, including chain venues with their pick of buildings and funds enough to install lifts and ramps. And even then, those with mobility issues can find it difficult to find spots that are fully accessible. So what hope do those looking for a nightlife venue for the sapphic community have when the only one is, up until widely recently, not even an option? To me, this reveals the party gates are so well catered for kind of sentiment as somewhat hollow when you consider these intersections of experience, that in fact the issue is an overall lack rather than one side being satisfied and the other left out entirely. And this isn't even looking at access needs beyond purely mobility based issues. Sensory issues, trouble standing for a long time, lack of accessible toilets that those who need extra space can use. These considerations for spaces to consider accessibility that are skipped over for many nightlife venues, perhaps due to the ideas around disabled people not being interested in these spaces at all. On the other side of things, with all stereotypes, we also have to be careful not to ignore those who fall under their umbrella for the sake of renouncing the stereotype altogether, because there are many disabled people who are 100% confirmed quiet gays, me being one of them. I cannot think of anything worse than a night out, truly. There are indeed those whose disability itself means that the kinds of activities that fall under the quiet gay remit are of more interest, more comfortable, or more accessible, or it might just be something that fits their personality. When we think about party gay spaces or quiet gay spaces and activities, to my mind, we should always be considering accessibility to everyone in our community who might be served by them. Okay, then what is Pride even for? In theory, Pride and Pride Month is a continued act of protest, fundamental to fighting for queer liberation, for all the myriad intersections of identities that queer people have. It's also a chance for a joyful celebration of how far we've come. But I wonder, given the increased commodification of Pride, which is seen through loud corporate floats and the aforementioned massive rainbow emblazoned Absolute Vodka ads, who is Pride for now? There's a public perception that Pride is this loud glitter bomb festival, a place for queer people to unabashedly show that love is love. And it can be, of course, but Pride also continues to be a place to advocate against injustice. We see in the parade itself banners with stats around current inequalities and anti-genocide chants of support, and charities handing out flyers to a crowd eager to support their work. There are many events that can and should be quiet, but there are also times when many people would say that being loud is necessary, particularly in times of injustice. Writer Tim Abbott, based in Australia, writes about honouring and respecting the history of Pride, or as they call it, Mardi Gras, from the earliest organisers and protests to the grandiose celebrations that they've now become in many major cities. But for himself, he writes that it simply doesn't feel like it's for him anymore. Increasingly, there's a growing number of queer folks on and offline, like Tim, who have been wanting to connect and feel part of the community, but know that these big Pride celebrations just aren't for them. I've been unable to reconcile feelings of loneliness, alienation, and disconnect at these large-scale queer events. Another writer and educator, Gregory Walters, echoes this. During prior Pride celebrations, there's been pressure, real or perceived, for me to be a more active participant. I felt guilty declining invitations from gay friends to join them at the parade or go to a packed club. I often walk home yet again feeling like a party pooper and questioning whether my crankiness means something bigger. Am I not proud? I think there are a few themes to pull out from both of these quotes. The stereotypes around what gay people look like and how they act, the fear of not being valid enough to be part of the community, that there are many, many people who don't find capital P pride to be fulfilling, and the big concern that they aren't being a good and proud gay because of it. If there are so many people feeling like the parades and loud spaces are not for them, then how can pride serve these people? The people who are feeling like they are the party poopers, the bad, boring, and not proud gays for not wanting the loudness that comes with the month. If we remember the history of what Pride is for queer people, for liberation, for anyone who isn't straight and cisgender to live their lives as fully and as gloriously as anyone else, maybe getting to the roots of it can help the quiet gays feel and know that they belong. For this, I want to look towards a book, The and Their Friends Between Revolutions, half fable, half gay manifesto written in 1977 by author Larry Mitchell with illustrations from Ned Astor. They describe the lives of the and their group of friends, which includes the strong women, the queens, the queer men, all as they attempt to survive, spend time with each other, and spread pleasure and joy in an empire in decline which is dominated by oppressive militaristic men. The book is a reminder of the groups of different people that the queer community consists of and how important each of these subgroups is to the community as a whole. Each room in the house is devoted to a different living form. One is filled with velvets and feathers and makeup and sparkles and costumes and silks. It is where the go when they want to transform themselves. Another room is for plants to live in, another is for quiet music, another is for silent eating, and another is for methodically drinking teas of healing herbs. All who live there move softly about the house, living all through it. At night, they sleep all together in the central room of the house. The fire glows over the large pillows that cover the floor, with the tribe covering the pillows. This small passage, part of the larger book and larger vision of queer community and spaces written in the 70s, is affirmation that quiet gays are essential. Journalist John Russell explains what, even 40 years after being published, the book can teach us. He turned his observations of pre-AIDS gay culture into a kind of parable conveying its values and conventions, such as they were, and imparting lessons meant to sustain future generations of queer people, with the ultimate goal of guiding them towards the social and sexual revolutions Mitchell hoped to see. So while Pride is and should always be a protest, it's also for us as individual queer people to celebrate the parts of ourselves that are still under attack in much of the world, and to understand that each part of our community is vital to support and validate. In conclusion, kink at Pride? No, I haven't decided to just burn everything down around me in a fit of madness by announcing a conclusion followed by the least conclusive possible discourse topic, but way before the end of this video. Kink at Pride is an entire video essay in and of itself that maybe I'll make at some point, but for the purposes of this video, I guess my hot take is that the debate about whether kink should be at Pride and to what extent wouldn't be as much of a debate if the idea of Pride as the one queer event that exists wasn't so prevalent, that this single day in the summer originally meant to mark a spontaneous and violent anti-police riot against queerphobia and transphobia has to be everything for everyone because we feel like that we have no alternatives. It's time to look at the alternatives. In the paper We're Here to Party, Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual and Trans Leisurescapes Beyond Commercial-Based Scenes, Kath Brown explains, conversely, access to and engagement with leisure activities increasingly defines social identities and lives. In the late 20th century, gay, and to a limited extent lesbian, leisure spaces in the UK and the US were explicated as sites of safety, community, political power and identity formation. Understandings of gay male leisure spaces as primarily located in urban, territorial gay ghettos, in sex areas, or on gay and lesbian commercial scenes have resulted in a dearth of inquiries that turn the focus to look beyond male and some lesbian socializing in gay, often commercial spaces, pride events, or tourist destinations. What might queer leisure spaces separate from these prominent conceptualizations look like? Well, ironically, that tweet from the start of the video bemoaning the lack of provisions for quiet gays, when it was posted, there were a few replies which pointed out that this person lived in Washington, D.C., where their official Pride actually has a whole host of non-party related events on its very website. We also have examples like the Quiet Queerness Project set up in India last year, creating accessible events for the queer community specifically away from commercial spaces. Their first event was a mix for queer persons, but with a code of conduct. As mental health professionals, they felt the need to create a structure where queer persons could mingle, be respectful of identity, create room for disagreement through professional facilitation, and just be. Family, heteronormativity, romance, monogamy culture, all of these have very specific structures. In queerness, there is no script. TQQP invites quietness in by creating rooms away from consumerist spaces. It steps away from the pressure to show the world that you're queer. Rather, it hopes to explore what it means to be queer without the pressure of constantly performing the identity. Mexico City, La Comuna is an autonomous space for queer and trans folks to gather, find refuge, and politically organise. They have a shop where local artists and producers can sell their products, and a reading and analysis club to discuss political issues. They organise events to promote the work of women and queer artists, like book presentations and poetry readings, and it began in 2020 as a community kitchen. In Paris, Violet & Co. is a feminist and lesbian bookstore and coffee shop inviting people to settle in with a book and hosts a variety of events that cater to the bookish quiet queer, and was saved from closure in 2022 by community fundraising. In recent years in London, we've seen a rapid rise in alternatives, although they've taken many years of dedication from organisers, fundraisers and activists to come to fruition. In 2022, for example, London got a permanent LGBTQ+ community centre, running events from discussion groups or social meetups to AA and NA meetings. In their own words, the centre is a sober sanctuary, a place for groups combating isolation in the queer community, bringing different generations together in a friendly setting and working with some of the most incredible charities and groups to offer LGBTQ+ specific services, such as sexual health testing and mental health support. That same year, we also saw the opening of the UK's first and only LGBTQ+ dedicated museum, Queer Britain, a small exhibit space with only a couple of rooms, but which is doing amazing work curating and preserving queer history. We've also had the opening of Common Press, a sober site which hosts a bookshop, event space, cafe, podcast recording studio, and which, as of me starting to script this video, has announced that they're at risk of closing. I'll leave a link to help support them stay open in the video description. There are also, of course, sites which have been here for years. Gaze the Word, my favourite bookshop in the world, has been a cornerstone of not just the bookish queer scene, but also queer activism and advocacy, created by a group of gay socialists in 1979 and serving as a meeting place for a number of advocacy and community groups over the years, including, famously, LGSM. There are also a number of queer youth meetups around the city, growing from only one that I could find as a teenager, including the amazing Mosaic. When this video goes out, I will actually be in the depths of Wales volunteering as a mentor at their summer retreat and have seen firsthand what they've managed to achieve with just a small team. I think these openings invite the question of what queer spaces are for now, when the issues that created historical queer spaces from the first part of this video are no longer as pressing, now that we aren't relying on mafia-owned bars to avoid legal troubles. Are queer spaces moving from necessity to something else entirely as we gain wider social acceptance? I mean, we're obviously not entirely there yet, but the legal necessity of secrecy isn't there anymore, and I think it's good to imagine expansive futures. Do we want to be investing in and exploring spaces of genuine community building, of history preserving, identity forming, or romantic or sexual connection, and what might those look like? And do we see all these spaces as commercial business ventures, or is there more of a space for other models? What do permanent spaces of simply queer existence look like that don't demand anything of your presence there? How far can we look to our own homes or public spaces as sources of this kind of community? To answer these questions, I think we need to look at another supposed divide in the queer experience, and coincidentally, one of my least favourite subjects at school, geography. Where queer people are living and how that matters. City spaces, simply by nature of having more people, may provide more events and a greater variety of them. Looking back at the history of queer spaces that I discussed earlier, we can see that these famous and impactful places were all themselves in cities. I think this is part of the divide that's maybe subconsciously formed in many people's minds between urban spaces and rural spaces when it comes to queer people, because there's a lot of opposing perceptions that are created through this geographic division. Catherine Schreikhofer in Queering the Countryside writes that we associate urban with out and proud and rural with closeted and homophobic. So often when we think of coming out or being part of the queer community, it's connected with being in a big city or even moving there, attending large pride parades and going to gay bars. I think that this runs the risk of perpetuating the idea that there is no space for quiet gays in cities themselves, but also it creates this broader harmful narrative that there are no queer people living in rural spaces, that there's simply no events or community outside of big cities. This focus on queer experiences being pretty homogenous and only happening in urban areas is what's known as metronormativity, which highlights the queer migration from country to city, from rural homophobia to urban liberation, dominating and monopolizing the discursive space of queer life. In other words, metronormativity perpetuates the idea that modern queer achievement, being out, open, and visibly and loudly queer in the city, is the be-all and end-all. This idea potentially works to erase the queer people who are not in urban areas and those in any location who don't fit the stereotypical representations of what being gay really is, a layer of misconceptions that serves no one. The perceived incompatibility with rural life and queerness is clear in examples like this TikTok by user Neris Bueller, which reads, "When you just want to move out of the city and be surrounded by trees 24/7, but you're queer and you haven't met your forever partner yet, so you feel like you have to stay in the city to increase your chances of finding love." It's captioned with a Hannah Gadsby quote, where do the quiet gays go? Where are the quiet gays supposed to go? The pressure on my people to express our identity and pride through the metaphor of party is very intense. The comments section is filled with hundreds of people who either live rurally and relate, or live in the city and want to move away to the country but are worried about not finding their people. All these people are communicating that they want to be connected with community, but the city and the busyness and loudness of it isn't suiting them, but yet they feel like they can't leave. And if they do, that they're doomed to loneliness. This definitely connects more generally to the recent video I did around catch-up friendships and the epidemic of loneliness that we're facing. Urban or rural, people are wanting to connect more, but feeling lonely without community despite that. It's hard to make those connections if you don't know how to find these quiet events, or there simply aren't people or spaces around you. However, rural spaces are increasingly, due to a variety of reasons, including non-corporatized pride events, less funding, and less people, becoming examples of where the quiet gays go. Misconceptions around rural spaces are being challenged by small communities globally. These rural queer spaces are often creating events in quieter ways, again, some due to budgeting, sponsorships, and being separated from major pride organizations, but also because they're able to speak with and connect with the individuals in their community directly in ways that being in a city just don't seem to allow. There are more and more examples of rural queers organizing events that serve them and their needs specifically, including sober events, family-friendly events, and 18+ events, quiet events, crafty events, even farming-related events. For example, a friend in the province of Nova Scotia in Canada just attended Petite Queer Pride, an artist-led rural pride festival that brought together around 200 individuals living rurally. The day's schedule included a barbecue, a talk from elder lesbians, craft stations, yoga, and gentle gymnastics on the garden lawns. This event served to provide a space for people to quietly gather if they like, making friendship bracelets or felt pendant flags, or connect with things like speed friending events to connect rural queer people with other rural queer people. Dr. Emilie Maine, who in fact co-wrote this very video, focused her academic research on a small town in the province of Alberta in Canada, and found that despite the challenges of living rurally as a queer person, being under more surveillance and scrutiny, dealing with toxic masculinities and conservative politics, many rural queer people have made and found fulfilling spaces for themselves in the places that were imagined to be uninhabitable for them. In fact, she found that within the queer rural experience of place, there was a much more active participation in community building and support. One participant in the study said that they felt where they lived rurally is a good place to live, mainly thanks to the small queer community that's developed and just continued to get stronger and stronger. The more of us that join, I guess, it was like the tiniest little seed, and then it's very slowly growing and growing and growing, and those roots are getting a lot stronger. For the pride events that are created there with the strong community ties, these roots have allowed for rural queer people to ask each other what they want to see, which has often included quieter events, accessible events, and sober events. I think it's also worth uplifting the types of spaces that aren't necessarily seen as important or valid in their removal from traditional ideas of commercial leisure sites. Lesbian authors have long noted the invisibilization of the ways in which lesbians use and organize space. Where there are no visible markers or signifiers on the landscape, the neighborhoods or social spaces that lesbians create and inhabit can risk being ignored. Similarly, where LGBT socializing takes place beyond commercial scenes and in less visible ways, it is easily overlooked. Because almost all the queer spaces that I've mentioned in this section, from the bookshops and community centres to the youth groups and museums, owe their continued existence to the community itself, not just as paying patrons, but as donors in moments of crisis, voices demanding that these spaces exist in the first place, volunteers working to keep them running. To me, it's clear that queer spaces are strongest when they're constructed and maintained by the passion of the queer people within them, not the interests of investors or outside forces. Don't underestimate what your support can achieve, whether it's for increasing the accessibility of local nightlife spots, raising funds to keep queer educational spaces like museums and libraries open, hosting other quiet queer friends in your community and your home through a games night. It can be tempting to look at the loudest public voices and assume that that is all that's available to you. But engaging with your local community, actively searching through event listings, reaching out to venues to ask about their programming, and maybe even starting an event yourself could be ways to empower all of us, queer and party queers alike, to find our people. Because I think ultimately, at the heart of all of these venues and histories and frustrations, that is what we are all trying in our own ways to find. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw and you would like to help support me make videos like this, then I will leave a link to my Patreon in the description. And we're also trying something a bit new that we're going to be adding to Patreon, which is a kind of like added extras bonus video for patrons about the topic. So we've got some stuff that was cut for time, some little questions, provocations. I have the wonderful Sparks here who edits these videos, Hello, Sparks, who is going to be having a chat with me about what he's been thinking about as he's been listening to me record. So check that out if you would like to. I will also leave a link to all my social media so you can find me all over the internet as well. And a final thank you to today's sponsor, Matchmasters. If you would like a chance to enter the giveaway to win a £250 voucher for Spectrum Apparel and also download a very fun game that you can play with your friends, then the link is going to be in the description. And until I see you next time, bye.